clothing, perhaps a North Charleston Police Department shirt, tase it, and see if that tasing made a difference to the fact?
Sure. There are several variables with that: time, amount of the arc, et cetera, that you would have to consider, but yeah, that's plausible.
And let's just suppose such a thing took place, the proper examination of that would have been microscopically. Is that correct?
I'm unsure. I honestly don't know.
And would you think that you would look for a melted piece of fabric caused by the electrical current in the taser?
With my my firefighter experience I've had and seeing polyester melt to people's skin, I would say that if it's arcing hot enough, you probably would see some type of melting or some type of demarcation that where it had burned that type of clothing.
So even for a non-scientist, if you will, people who are familiar with electrical current knows that electrical current can burn.
Correct.
And that examination did not take place in your presence, is that correct?
No, sir. Not that I'm aware of.
How about the clothing of Mr. Scott? The green shirt that's been mentioned, the blue pants that have been mentioned?
It was done in the same environment as previously, same way Officer Slager's clothing was examined. It was examined in the same area, the same environment.
So even if clothing is wet in some form, the distribution, the disturbance, the disturbance of the fabric can still be examined microscopically.
Sure.
And the fact that it may have had some other material on it certainly wouldn't interfere with that examination.
May or may not. Sure.
But at least one would try. Correct?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Now, do you know or do you recommend, as the investigator on scene, certain scientific examinations to be made of all the evidence you collect?
Usually as I'm going through, my general practice is if I see something that sticks out, I immediately, if I write it down, I'm liable to write down what I think testing may be done back at the laboratory. I do that kind of just as a reminder myself, so when I go back through my notes and I'm typing, if something hasn't been ordered on a particular item of evidence, I know to say, hey, yes, I wanted this done, so let's see if we can't get this done as well.
On the 4th of April of 2015, on scene, that is at the location where the incident took place, you took notes, did you not?
Yes, sir, I did.
And you were there for some 3 hours, is that correct?
I believe that's correct.
And during the course of those 3 hours, you wrote down certain things that were important to you.
Yes, sir.
Is that correct? And you wrote down on your notes that you need DNA and fingerprints on an officer's taser.
May I refer to my notes just to confirm? And you're referring to my handwriting notes, correct?
Yes, sir. One page of notes that you took that day.
Yes, I do see that at the bottom of the page. Yep. DNA and fingerprint on an officer taser.
So you didn't ask for just DNA. You asked for DNA and fingerprints on the officer's taser because you knew, given the circumstances of what you understood to have happened, that it was essential to see whose fingerprints and whose DNA was on the taser.
I believe it could be probative.
Because, and probative means what, sir?
That it could be of value. It could answer questions that we don't have the answer to or need.
For the jury to understand the credibility of the issues in this trial.
Yes, sir.
Now, do you have the taser in front of you?
Do not.
Let me see if I can.
What's that?
I'm looking at State's Exhibit number 49.
Yeah.
Would you take that as a fact? Right, and I would like the jury to see this as best they can, so if you can hold it in a way that the jury, all of them can see it. We're looking at the lateral side of the taser. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And on the taser, the surface of the taser is different in different locations. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
And different surfaces are better adapt for different types of evidence collection. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So a surface that's conducive for fingerprints may not be conducive for DNA.
Correct.
Is that correct? And vice versa. So DNA evidence surfaces may not be conducive for fingerprints.
Correct.
So if I was to, if you can see my shoes,
Yes, sir.
and put my fingerprint on a clean rubber sole with ridges in it, that would be conducive for DNA. Is that correct?
In my expertise, you can get both. But there again, some, I know at our laboratory at the time, they preferred to pick one or the other as to what you were looking for.
But you, on the scene, on the crime scene that day, based on your knowledge and your expertise and your history of gathering evidence, knew that it was possible to obtain both fingerprints and DNA from the same object.
Yes, sir.
And the object you're holding in front of you is the taser that was used on April 4th.
Mm-hmm.
Would you show the members of the jury, please, those areas on the taser that are conducive to obtaining fingerprints?
Sure. Any area that is considered a smooth surface, smooth hard surface, can be conducive to get prints. There are some texture surfaces that you can still get fingerprints from, but in this case here, around the grip area, there's some texture spots around the grip and around this part of the grip here in the front where the fingers wrap around. Those areas probably wouldn't be too conducive to get prints. The other area in the center here of the cartridge, there's a logo here that could impede, but there is some smoothness here that could get a fingerprint. There's also some smooth areas here at the front and the sides of the near where the cartridge attaches that could also get a print, as well as some of the surfaces on top as well.
I should have asked, but that red thing on there is not really part of the taser.
I wasn't sure.
That's for safety, is that correct?
I've never seen it, so I couldn't tell you.
Okay, but it's not part of the taser.
Okay.
So if the story was given to you as the crime scene investigator and you were trying to gather all important evidence, and if there was a fight over the taser,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a struggle back and forth,
Mm-hmm.
actually my thumbprint is right on that X26, isn't it?
I can't see it from the naked eye, but
Well, the surface of the yin and the yang, if you will, is right over that flat surface.
it could be that. But what you also have to take into account is the movement that was occurring. So as you are occurring movement, you are messing up where ridge placement or where fingerprint placement is. So you might get more of a smudge or a smear as opposed to an actual legible print.
And you would only know that after you examine it.
Yes, sir.
And guesswork in murder cases is not a good thing.
No, absolutely not.
Guesswork in murder cases involving a police officer on the job is not a good thing.
No, sir.
So the other surface that's involved, there are multiple surfaces on the taser that DNA can be derived from. Is that correct?
Yeah, I agree.
So if there was a claim or there was a statement that somebody used the taser against Officer Slager, where would you look for the DNA?
Obviously, you could be concerned with the several areas, but specifically in order to fire the taser, the trigger has to be engaged. So most likely the trigger face would be an area you could swab for DNA as well.
Now, you didn't conduct the DNA test, did you?
No, sir, I did not.
You didn't obtain it. As the gatherer of evidence, you weren't the party who gathered the DNA.
No, sir, I was not.
If you had gathered the DNA, if you had, sir, and you knew what the story was, would you have gathered DNA from specific parts of the taser so that you could tell where the DNA was registered on the taser?
I would apply it back to my previous cases where I've had firearms involved, and I do that for firearms. I will designate certain areas, so I'll swab the grip area, swab the trigger face separately, and then maybe swab the barrel or the fore end of the firearm. So I would, in the same way, it would be easy to break this up in the same manner.
So that when you tell the story of what happened that day through forensic evidence, you could come before the jury and say, we found Mr. X's DNA on the trigger, we found Mr. Y's DNA on the pistol grip, we found a combination DNA on some other area so that it's effective and it's meaningful to the jury where the DNA was found.
That's a probable analogy.
Because in this case, if it's not done properly, the prosecutor could come back and say, well, we don't know how that DNA got there.
That's probable, yes, sir.
But if it had been examined proportionately, different areas of the instrument, we could say with certainty how that DNA got there.
Yes, sir.
And you've done that all your career.
Yes, sir.
And the way you do it is with a Q-tip.
Sterile swab.
Sterile Q-tip. And you rub a little area, and you put it in the bag, and you take another one and rub a little area and put it in the bag. And you mark the location on the object that the DNA was taken from.
Yes, sir.
And that's been your practice.
Yes, sir.
And that's what you asked to be done in this case.
Yeah, initially, yes.
And some captain overruled you. Correct?
Yes, sir.
Even though you were the case agent in charge.
No, I was not the case agent in charge.
Excuse me, even though you were the evidence collector in charge, the one who had the most expertise in this area, you were the guy.
Yes, sir.
Now, the board behind you is something that you prepared to assist you in telling the story of what took place that day so that the jury could visually see, based on the evidence you collected, the location of the various parties at the time the evidence was deposited.
Yes, sir.
And tell the members of the jury why that's so important in telling the story.
Obviously, any area that you can't physically see yourself and you can't be there and see the evidence and the items as they sit in place, you need something to kind of be able to look and say, okay, where did things relate to? How am I related to? If I'm maybe familiar with that area, I know where that road is, but I'm not sure where this area is at. So how do I relate integral items of evidence in relation to the area in which they were found in?
So generally, as a general practice, as a crime scene investigator, you start from the wide angle.
Yes, sir.
Like you say, the 30,000-foot level, and then we pare it down so that the jury has a relationship, a spatial relationship of where evidence was gathered in terms of the overall crime scene.
Yes, sir.
The crime scene that you have on this board, is that the full crime scene?
To my knowledge, yes, sir.
Well, actually, the crime scene starts on the corner of Craig and Remount. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir. Right there in the parking lot of the Vance Auto.
Okay. And so the proportion on that diagram is maybe not exact, but it gives us a general reference to the location of various areas of the crime scene. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And the distance between where the two vehicles are, not perhaps on this board, but in real life, the distance to the entrance to Yellow Brick Road, how far was that?
With the information I have here, I couldn't tell you.
And I know you had that little instruction deal thing you talked about, a Hilly.
The Hilti, the measuring device, yes, sir.
Yes. Would that have measured that distance?
I believe so. I believe we may have took that measurement. I'm not 100% sure.
But that wasn't done that day.
Not that I'm aware of, no.
And the distance between the entry to what has been called Yellow Brick Road to those various spots that are marked on that board, were those measurements done?
You're talking about from the entrance to Craig Road to?
The entrance to Yellow Brick Road, as I look at it, the vertical black is Craig Road, correct?
Yes, sir.
And then the yellow, unidentified, is what's been called Yellow Brick Road.
Yes, sir.
So on Yellow Brick Road, from the entryway on Craig Street to where the various markers are, do we know the distance?
Not from Craig Road. We just know the distance from the reference points that were used.
Well, if one wanted to know how far Officer Slager had run that day, before the physical confrontation, how would we know that?
Our Faro scanner guy who did the Faro scans, he was able to interpret distances in between spatial items in the crime scene.
So,
Spatial items in the crime scene.
so at some point in time during the investigation, perhaps not on April 4th or 5th, but later on, those measurements were made for the benefit of the jury.
I don't know if they were made, but they could have been made from the Faro scanner. I don't know if they were or were not.
And just from your human experience, not even the crime scene part of it, estimate how far that was
From where to where?
from where the vehicles were abandoned until where the fight took place.
50 to 75 yards.
50 to 75, might have been 200.
I'm basing on my football experience, so I'm guessing 50 to 75 is what I remember. I walked it several times. So.
Now, the other spatial relationships to tell the story would be that there was movement in the crime scene, that the parties involved in the crime scene were in movement, correct?
Yes, sir.
So by identifying the area where the first taser shot took place, we can gauge the distance between the first taser shot and the second taser shot, correct?
I would agree, yes.
And we can also gauge the relationship between the hat and the wallet and the watch to other areas on your schematic.
Correct.
What would be the importance of that? What is it about that that the jury, telling the jury the story of what happened? How are those measurements important to the jury?
Well, it's not only just the measurements, but it's also how things transpired by being able to show that a taser event was deployed at one location. There was obviously something that happened between that location and the next time a taser had to be deployed again. So just knowing that there were the two separate events in two separate areas, signifies there was something that happened between those two areas for there to be a second deployment. And then obviously between the second deployment and where the cartridge is actually located, you can record, everything that you find all around there is important as to what may have transpired between those 2 points.
And as part of a moving crime scene, it would be important for the jury to have an idea of what took place at what location so the jury can judge for itself the type of movements that were made.
Yes, sir.
And most of the movements that your diagram shows are down Craig Road, turning right onto Yellow Brick Road, and a progression of evidence droppings along the way. Is that
Correct.
correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, if you look at, before I go there, is it sometimes difficult to tell the plane of evidence? Do you know what I mean by that?
You mean the level, on the level that it's on?
You and I are now in the same plane, correct?
Yes, sir. With me sitting down and you still upright.
Well,
I mean, it's probably a level to.
Our body.
Yes.
We're in the same line, the same plane.
Yes, sir.
And if I move to the right 3 or 4 steps, we're no longer in the same plane.
Correct.
And the reason for various photographs of the same thing are so that the juries can understand where items are located vis-a-vis other items of evidence. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Because you can say whether it's on a video or whether it's a still shot, depending on where that photograph is taken from, you could be misled as to the plane of the object.
Could be, yes, sir.
So, if Sergeant Gann's vehicle, for example, he unknowingly drove through the middle of the crime scene. Is that correct?
I'm getting that information, but I'm not 100% sure that actually occurred.
You've seen his vehicle.
Correct. The one that's in the center of the yellow road,
And-
depicted here?
And it's located as close to the hat and the wallet and the wallet.
Correct.
And depending what angle you look at that, you could say, well, it's in the same plane as the front door, the same plane as the back door, the same plane as the rear tire, or perhaps it's behind you.
Correct. Yes, sir.
And so, let's take a look at evidence 118, state's evidence 118. Again, I'm talking in terms of locating evidentiary objects in the same plane. Marking number 7 represents a watch and a wallet.
Correct? Yes, sir.
Do we know whose watch and wallet that is?
By looking at it in this, no.
Do we know whose hat item marker number 6 is?
No.
Do we know whether 6 and 7 are related to this incident?
Not just by seeing it without other additional information.
With marker number 8, 9, and 10, do we know what those are?
Cartridge cases.
And do we know how those cartridge cases are related to this event?
It's based on association with information provided.
The testimony you gave earlier was that there was an evaluation of those casings, and they were from the weapon in the custody of Officer Slager that day.
Correct?
Correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, would you say that this 118 fairly, for purposes of the jury's evaluation of what happened, fairly and accurately represents the fact that 7, 6, 8, 9, and 10 are on the approximate same plane?
I would concur with that.
And if marker number 6 and 7 are objects owned by Mr. Scott, what does that location tell us about items 6 and 7?
That somehow they came deposited there.
And would that be an indication that that's where the fight took place?
It could be.
Is that the location that the law enforcement investigation of this case has assumed that's where the fight took place?
I'm not sure if that's where they assumed it took place, but I mean, it's possible. All you have from a photograph and what you see is what you see. You can extend your imagination or my imagination to what have or what may have occurred, but what you have is what have. You have evidence there. You have to be able to assimilate how it got there and why it's there.
You had earlier mentioned, I want to come back to this, but I want to take a side to it. You had mentioned a cell phone.
Yes, sir.
And that's in evidence, correct?
Yes, sir.
And there are photographs of it.
Yes, sir.
And there are photographs of where it was found.
Yes, sir. I believe right here.
State's Exhibit number 35, if you would unpack that.
Yes, sir.
As part of gathering evidence and telling the story of what happened that day to the jury, you had mentioned earlier that the phone was cracked.
Yes, sir. Screen was cracked.
Would you, from that distance, they can look at it later, just show them what you're talking about?
You look at the phone, the bottom of the phone here, you can see it's cracked heavily at the bottom of the phone, and then there's a few lines that extend up toward the front and the top of the screen.
If you would look at the edge of the phone closest to the cracks, what do you see there?
Which edge are you referring to? The bottom?
Bottom edge.
Bottom edge, okay. I could see some more indentation, some marks, things of that nature.
Do you see yellow paint marks, scuffs on the phone?
I do not. No, sir.
If there were yellow paint marks on the phone, and there had been an examination of those paint marks, and compared to the yellow paint and Yellow Brick Road, we could tell that the phone was dropped in some fashion on the Yellow Brick Road. Is that correct?
Possibly.
Right. Did you ask that examination to be done?
No, sir.
You know if SLED did do that examination?
I have no clue.
You know if SLED had chips from that phone in their possession for over a year?
I have no idea.
But you understand the value of telling the story to the jury, if that is correct?
Absolutely.
Now, going back to 118, if Officer Slager had a right-handed Glock weapon, by looking at 118, can you tell us where he was standing at the time the shots were fired?
There's a lot of variables in that, but generally speaking, most Glocks, having shot one myself, most of them extend out to the right. There's various degrees, environmental factors that can change that. So if you're asking me just from my limited experience, I'll be more than happy to answer that. Typically, it would probably been, if you're looking at this photo, it would have been to the right and slightly above where the cartridge cases would eject it out and then back to right behind him.
And in order to approximate the distance, but we know that it's an ejection to the right, correct?
Yes, sir.
And to know the approximate distance, it would require one to fire that weapon.
Correct.
To see how far the ejection, what angle of attack that ejection took place, how far it went.
Correct.
And of course, the surface in which the ejection fell on would also have an impact on how far it rolled.
Correct. Yes, sir.
But we do know without any question, as an absolute, that facing 118, all of us now are looking at 118, the shots were fired to the right of those markers.
Yes, if the officer was facing us in that photograph, they would have been to his right and back.
Now, if one claimed that they were trying to avoid pain from a taser, one would run away from the person with the taser. Is that correct?
Depends. Some people are more aggressive and would run to a fight than as opposed to run away, so that's what I mean by that.
And by the indication of this is where the fight took place in 6 and 7, if that is correct. I'm not saying it is, but if that's an indication of location of the fight, the movement was from the bottom of this screen to the top of this screen to the right. Is that correct?
I'm not sure if I could make that correlation.
But we know that Officer Slager was standing somewhere in the top right-hand side of the screen. We know that because it's 8, 9, 10, 11.
Correct.
And if we believe that the fight took place at 6 and 7, the movement of the parties looking at 118 would be up and to the right.
Could the parties been going the opposite way? I'd have to pose that question as an expert in that area. I mean, because could they have gone the other way? Because there's evidence there. Again, it's all about context. So if you look at the context of the other evidence involved, is to say that the fight could have gone the other direction as well. I think you have to be fair. You have to pose both possibilities.
Let's try this. If the fight took place before the firing of the weapon,
Mm-hmm.
would the movement of the parties be from the bottom of this photograph up and to the right?
I just don't know if that's something I'm capable to answer.
Without any experience in crime scenes at all and human observations, that would be correct.
I'm not sure. I haven't been an officer. I've been in fights before. I've been in altercations personally and as an officer, and there's so many variables that go on. There's movement back and forth, so I don't know if I can correctly give you a correct answer on that without being wrong.
With respect to the collection of evidence,
Mm-hmm.
if we could take this down, going back to your diagram, if a taser was shot 2 separate times, as I believe you testified, there would be evidence of 4 doors. Is that correct?
Yes, correct. Would be correct.
And you found 4 doors.
I believe so, yes, sir. I believe
And
so.
you've located them on the diagram.
Yes, sir.
If there was 2 discharges of probes, there would be 2 cartridges found. Is
Correct.
that correct?
Yes, sir.
If there were 2 discharges of the taser with the probes, there'd be 4 wires found.
Yes, sir.
How many wires did you find?
Because the wires were in numerous areas, there were definitely more than 4, but to be able to attribute what was connected to which wire and which cartridge, we were unable to assess.
Is there any evidence that there were wires consistent with the weapon being fired more than twice?
Not that we were able to ascertain.
And the way you would ascertain that is to measure the wire, because they're all standard size, correct?
That could be one possibility, yes.
So if there were 4 wires found near Mr. Scott, you would measure them and look at them to see whether they were broken and what the total length was, because the total length of a taser wire is a fixed number. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, I believe so.
And what is that number?
I don't know. I don't know right off the top of my head. They come in I know they come in various distances. I want to say one's 25 or 50.
How does one conclude to tell the jury what happened that day if one doesn't even know the length of the wires?
That's just not an examination we perform. That's
And
not
how
something.
does one tell the jury whether or not the wires were broken or not if we don't measure them?
And there again, with the wires being broken, how do you attribute which wires went to which cartridge? There's not a serial number to attach them to.
Well, you had previously indicated that you did this examination of the AFIDs and you
Correct.
linked them to the cartridge.
Correct.
Correct?
Yes, sir.
And the first AFIDs you found closest to Craig Street went to the cartridge that you found on Yellow Brick Road.
Yes, sir.
Correct?
Yes, sir.
And you found the 2 wires that were shot from the first discharge of the taser. Correct?
Yes, sir. Correct.
And so one would conclude then that the second discharge of the taser is the one prong that struck Mr. Scott. Correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, how many prongs did you find?
I believe 3 were recovered.
And how many prongs should have been recovered?
4.
And if the prongs had been recovered, it would be easier for you to figure out whether there was electrical circuitry that could have been used to cause pain to Mr. Scott.
That wouldn't be something I would do, but I'm sure that could be done, yes.
Because an examination of the probes, an examination of the wire would tell us whether electrical current had passed through. Is that correct?
I believe that can be done, yes.
And in this case, after 3 hours, was the crime scene abandoned before they were found?
What do you mean abandoned?
In other words, you knew, or anybody with SLED knew that day, the type of evidence that should be found, that we knew without a doubt existed at the crime scene. But the examination that was done in those 3 hours didn't produce it. Is that correct?
Correct. When we released the scene to our field agents locally. So when we released the scene, we believe that we had done a thorough examination to the best of our ability at that time.
And that's because the same captain that instructed you not to get fingerprints and DNA, is the one that determined close shop or going home.
That would be something they would decide after we left.
Captain Neal, correct?
I'm assuming he may have been, I'm sure he was in that discussion.
Now, in looking for the probes, they're made of metal. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So that if you had a metal detector, that would be a good way to find it.
Could be, yes, sir.
Was a metal detector used that day?
I don't believe so, no, sir.
Was there any attempt to identify where the missing probe would be?
We do, like I said, we do a walkthrough of the areas where we've collected evidence once we've picked up evidence to look for any other secondary evidence that we may have missed that may have not have been previously marked. And upon doing so, we did not find any. I know we discussed, I believe, the missing probe and that, where it could have been, and there was some talk of where various places it could have been.
But we can agree that the missing probe is essential evidence to assist the jury in determining the facts of this case.
Yes, sir.
And we know, or we could have known, on April 4th, the distance that a taser would fire in delivering a probe downstream. Correct?
Correct, I believe so.
Those are standard distances. So that if the probe became uncoupled with the wire, we'd know exactly where to look for it.
Okay. That's not information I have, but
But that information was available on April 4th.
not directly, no. I mean, we had the evidence that was there, but we didn't have, I wasn't sure what information can be downloaded or information that can be gathered from a taser.
Well, we know how a taser operates, correct?
Yes, sir.
And we know there are two prongs that can operate.
Yes, sir.
Correct? And we know that one has a straight line of attack, and that the other one has an 8-degree separation.
I did not know that.
How could you then possibly know where to start to look for the probe?
We had training about the integral parts of a taser, and specifically with the aphids and the doors, and so that's where we knew that information, and that had come up in some previous cases in the state before, so we knew to begin to look for those and to try to identify those.
You're familiar with firearms,
Yes, sir.
and you're familiar with where the firearm was used by Officer Slager.
Possibly used, but based on my limited experience, yes, sir.
And you knew the trajectory of the bullets from Officer Taser's gun to where they wound up. You knew the correct trajectory. You knew the location where those bullets were fired.
Approximately, yes.
The crime scene ended, as I understood earlier, at the fence. Is that correct?
Correct. Essentially, what our involvement did ended in this area in here from the car in the area where the brick road was. And one thing we do, multiple field agents were called that particular day. And so one thing we do while we're focusing on the main scene, we'll ask a lot of the field agents to, as they're walking the periphery looking for other evidence or to talk with witnesses and things of that nature, if they find something to let us know so we can go and do it the same way, document and collect it the same way.
Thank you. Do you have the pointer?
Yes, sir, I do. Yes, sir.
I want to walk with you, if I can, to the jury's benefit. I'll go back to the taser. We know on both occasions when the prongs were employed, this is the direction in which the prongs would have traveled. Is that correct?
Well, that's the direction the aphids traveled, so one could assume that that's the direction that they.
And we know, can you tell me where Slager was right here?
This was a taser, I believe another taser cartridge.
Where is Officer Slager when he fired his weapon?
There again, based on my limited expertise, I would say he was in this area, general area right in here.
Around here.
I know a little bit further up. I'd say probably, yeah, because these are back.
And we know the trajectory was in this direction.
Correct.
So based on that, we would know where to look for projectiles, the bullets that may have missed its target.
Correct.
Was that done?
And like I said, in the general area, yes.
Within the fence?
Yes, sir, within the fence.
But the fence has holes.
Yes, sir.
The chain link fence.
Yes, sir.
Did we look for markings on the chain link fence?
No, we did not.
And downrange from where Mr. Scott was is a commercial area. Is that
Correct. Yes, sir.
And if the shots were fired in that direction, the bullets were not recovered, did anybody express concern about somebody being injured downrange?
No, like there again, with our field agents that were combing the area, we asked them to, as they're going to those, because they were going to those buildings and to interview people in that area, we had asked them if they did come across anything or saw anything that appeared to be related to let us know. and we were not advised
Do
of
you know
anything.
whether anybody was ever interviewed to see if there were any injuries suffered by any citizens downrange?
I've not heard of any, no, sir.
Do you know whether anybody looked at the wooden fence across the street to see whether there were any holes in it?
No, sir.
Eventually they did.
Yes, sir.
Only after Mr. Slager's crime scene investigator looked at the area.
Correct. Yes, sir.
And Mr. Slager's crime scene investigator took pictures of the holes in the fence
Yes, sir.
and used the child's toy to find the projectiles. Is that correct?
I don't know what they used to find the projectiles. I know they did find them.
And that's what has been introduced into evidence today, is the two projectiles that were found downstream.
Yes, sir.
And that was done after SLED did the examination on April 4th and subsequent investigations with scanners and airplanes and all sorts of other things. The two projectiles were found.
Let me refer to my notes if you mind. Yes, sir, that would be correct.
And those two projectiles that were found by Mr. Slager's crime scene investigator were properly handled and turned over untouched to law enforcement.
Correct.
I believe your testimony was that on April 4th you headed to the incident location and that your colleague went to the North Charleston Police Department.
Yes, sir.
And at the time your colleague arrived at the North Charleston Police Department, she was under your supervision or not?
Not at the Charleston Police Department, no.
She was acting on her own,
Yes, sir.
but with guidance from the case agent, Ms. Peterson, Captain Neal, and all the other.
Yes, and I believe she may have called me a couple times to confer on some things.
And when she went to the North Charleston, she did that for the purpose of collecting the weapon that was used, the legal weapon, the Glock.
Yes, sir.
Is that correct? And she also collected the taser, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And she also collected the uniform for Mr. Slager.
Correct.
And that uniform consisting of pants and a shirt.
Yes, sir.
Did she collect the shoes that he was wearing?
The what, sir?
Shoes, boots.
I don't believe so, no.
If somebody had been in a fight and was in a ground fight, one of the things that a crime scene investigator would look for would be scuff marks. Is that correct?
Could be.
And if the ground fight took place on the yellow brick road, you would look for the yellow marking on the toes or the heels or whatever.
Sure.
Was that done in this?
No, sir.
If one knew that there had been ground fight and there had been a fight over the taser, besides taking the DNA from the taser and the fingerprints from the taser, one would look at a duty belt, correct?
Could be, yes, sir.
And the duty belt is what's wrapped around the police officer that carries his different equipment.
Correct, yes, sir.
Was that collected?
Not initially, no, sir.
And so there was no opportunity to look for DNA or trace evidence or any other indicator to confirm the fight that took place earlier that day.
No, sir.
Somebody realized within a day or two that that was a huge mistake. Is that correct?
Correct. We had actually had a discussion that day about the duty belt, and it was determined that we weren't going to collect that at the time, and I believe it was collected later.
That would be the same Captain Neal?
I believe so, yeah.
And so when the item was collected, it had already been redistributed to some other employee at North Charleston. Is that correct?
I'm not aware of that.
But certainly the chain of custody was lost. In fact, until today, there still has not been an examination of the duty belt. Is that correct?
Not that I'm aware of, Mr.
Not an examination of the handcuffs. Is that correct?
Not that I'm aware of.
Not an examination of the radio that was used that day.
Not that I'm aware of.
Not an examination of the body microphone that was used that day.
Not that I'm aware of.
In fact, as of today, the body microphone, nobody even knows where it is. Correct?
I'm not aware of that.
So that if somebody wanted to test how the distance that microphone and recording device in the car, how far away you could get, that's never been tested because nobody ever collected it.
I'm unaware. So I have no clue.
But it is important. It would be important for this jury to know why certain things are recorded and why others are not.
Correct.
Just because it's not recorded doesn't mean it didn't happen, correct?
Correct.
Just because a video doesn't properly record doesn't mean it didn't happen. Is
Correct.
that correct?
Yes, sir.
When the officer, your colleague, went to the North Charleston Police Department, they met with Officer Slager. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, yes, sir.
And at that time, a GSR kit was done.
Correct, I believe so.
That would be the gunshot residue kit was taken of Officer Slager some 3 to 4 hours after the incident.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Correct.
And when the gunshot residue kit was taken, the gunshot residue is actually trace elements. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And the State Law Enforcement Division Laboratory has a trace element section.
Yes, sir.
And besides gunshot residue, trace element section can look for transfer fabrics, correct?
Yes, sir.
If there's a fight, transfer of hair.
Yes, sir.
You can look for an exchange of DNA and bodily fluids.
Yes, that's done by a different section than trace, but yes, sir, they can do that.
But at Columbia there, touch DNA is actually the DNA I just put on this panel. And it comes from little microscopic cells of my skin that are deposited there.
Yes, sir.
That's touch DNA.
Yes, sir.
So if one is fighting with clothing or one is fighting with a person, touch DNA, that is the excess cells on our skin, is left on different objects.
Yes, sir.
On clothing, on duty belts, on tasers, on guns, on handcuffs, on shoes, on watches, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that transfer would give proof positive to the jury that there was an exchange, bodily exchange, for some reason between the two parties involved.
It may or it may not.
Well, touch DNA can't jump, can it? I can't deposit DNA on the jury when I'm standing over here.
And it may not be there, too. There's some cases where they haven't gotten it.
But you have to look.
Yeah, absolutely.
And based on the statements that you all knew about on April 4th, you were obligated
Correct.
to look,
Correct.
to confirm the truthfulness of what Mr. Slager said.
Correct.
And it wasn't done.
Correct.
So that this jury has incomplete information because the state of South Carolina failed to do its job. Correct?
That's a question. Yes, sir.
And Mr. Brown, you were part of it.
Yes, sir.
And if you had to do it all over again, it certainly would have been done much more thoroughly and extensively instead of a rush of 3 hours at the crime scene.
I can't guarantee that. But there again, some of the examinations that you're referring to were things that would be done above my area, that would have to be a decision made further down the line.
And I don't mean to be personal about this.
Oh, I understand, yeah.
I mean, as an employee of SLED, some captain way above your pay grade made those decisions.
I made the decision at the scene. I'm not sure what decisions were made beyond that.
And this is the same state laboratory, state law enforcement division that gave press conference after press conference after April 4th.
Your Honor, that question assumes facts that are certainly not happening.
It's his cross-examination.
Restate the question.
This is the same state law enforcement division that gave press conference after press conference after press conference about the factual findings in this case. Is that correct?
Objection sustained.
Now, going back to your colleague's examination of evidence at the North Charleston Police Department, are you aware that Officer Slager was giving a drug test that day?
No, sir, I'm not.
Were you aware that his hand was still bleeding at the time that the photographs were taken at North Charleston Police Department?
I believe I was given that information, yes.
So that this minor little abrasion that we've heard about was bleeding for at least 3 to 4 hours following the incident. Is that correct?
Could be reasonable, yes.
And the examination of the vehicles took place in the warehouse, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you had indicated that there was an examination, exploration of Mr. Scott's vehicle.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And was there an inventory taken?
Yes, sir.
And where is that inventory?
Well, I have in my notes what we saw and what we documented. But a formal inventory, I believe that was done by the North Charleston Police Department. They had to provide that for the tow log, I believe.
Do you know whether or not an inventory?
Sorry that you're reaching breaking point. We're going to break for the day. To a good spot.
Sorry, Judge, I went over to 4 o'clock. I apologize.
All right. Any wrap-up questions for the day?
I'll just leave it at that, Judge.
All right. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to break for the day and start back at 9 tomorrow morning. Have a good evening.
I can't be here.
Please do not discuss the case or review anything concerning it. It's on the